Time passed. I changed 2 jobs and moved to a hill station for work, but last year's incident in the deep woods still lingers in my mind. Back in 2023, I took a solo trip to Shen Anda National Park to escape the chaos of city life. I took leave on a Friday and set out for the trip at 5 a.m. By 9 a.m., I was there, eager to set up camp before venturing onto the trails. My chosen spot was perfect, nestled among the trees, with a stream running nearby. After setting up my tent, I explored the trails, taking in the breathtaking views of the Blue Ridge Mountains. I stayed until sunset, mesmerized by the stunning view. The sunset was surreal, a moment of beauty that felt like the love I'd been seeking. I cooked my meal over a small flame and crawled into my tent around 10 p.m. Exhausted from the day, I quickly felt the pull of relaxation. Perhaps it was the peace, or simply the miles I'd walked. Outside, the nocturnal sounds of the forest came alive, yet they felt comforting, like nature's wind chimes creating a symphony of calm. But that peace shattered when I heard footsteps. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. I stayed still, hoping the sound would fade, but it grew louder. I realized I wasn't mistaken. My mind raced. Was it another camper, a local, or someone with more sinister intentions? Gathering courage, I unzipped my tent and peered outside. My headlamp cast a narrow beam, illuminating the woods. Just a few yards away, a man stood still. I could only make out his shadowy figure. He didn't seem threatening. Just another camper or so, I told myself. "Everything okay?" I called out, trying to sound calm but firm. The man mumbled something unintelligible, then slowly walked away without another word. I watched him disappear into the darkness. Convinced it was nothing, I climbed back into my sleeping bag, but it took hours for sleep to find me. The next day was uneventful, and I chalked up the encounter to an overactive imagination. I spent the day hiking again, soaking in the serenity of the park. Like the previous day, I stayed out until sunset. However, on my way back, I felt the unnerving sensation of being watched. I stopped briefly, but dismissed the feeling and returned to my campsite. That night, the footsteps returned. This time, I ignored them, convincing myself there was no threat. I turned over and forced myself to sleep, though it wasn't restful. The next morning, I woke up later than usual. As I sat up, I noticed a small tear in my tent near the zipper. It was barely noticeable, but it hadn't been there before. My mind raced. Could it have been an animal? The wind? Or someone with more deliberate intentions? That thought weighed heavily on my chest. The unsettling feeling that I wasn't alone grew stronger. By the third day, I'd had enough. I decided to move to a different campsite, hoping to leave the unease behind. I packed up and began hiking in search of a new spot farther away. The trails were quiet, offering a temporary sense of calm. Yet as I walked, the feeling of being watched intensified. Every so often, I'd hear a twig snap or leaves rustle behind me. Each time I stopped and turned, I found nothing, though my instincts screamed otherwise. The trail ahead stretched endlessly, winding through dense woods that offered little comfort. I quickened my pace, determined to outrun whatever or whoever was following me. Finally, I found a new campsite. It wasn't as secluded, but at that moment, I didn't care. That night, I barely slept. Every sound made me jump, and the darkness felt suffocating. As the first rays of sunlight broke through, I sat up, packed my gear, and headed straight for the ranger station. Determined, I reached the station and recounted my experience. "You're not the first person to report something like this," the ranger said. "Many hikers have shared similar stories. We've tried investigating multiple times, but never found anything, not a single clue, even in the deepest parts of the forest." His words were both validating and unsettling. I nodded, thanked him, and left the park that day, relieved to be heading home but shaken by what I'd experienced. Weeks passed, and I returned to my routine, yet the memories stayed with me. Shenandoah remains beautiful in my mind, but it's a beauty intertwined with darkness and fear. It's all good now, but what Eric, my best friend, and I went through 2 to 3 years ago was the weirdest experience of our lives. It was October 2022 when we decided to go hiking for the weekend in the Smoky Mountains of Tennessee. We had just finished our exams and needed a break. Our parents were chill about it, so we seized the opportunity to have some adventure. When we reached the Smokies, Eric, always the adventurous type, suggested we take an off-the-beaten-path trail. He claimed to have read online that it was fun. He said it aloud with his trademark grin. To be honest, it was fun, at least for the most part. The hike began on the coolest note. We walked under endless green canopies, listening to birds chirping and inhaling the earthy scent of soil. At one point, I even kicked off my shoes to walk barefoot on a grassy patch just to feel more connected to nature. We followed the trail for hours, occasionally stopping to take pictures or argue over which direction to go. Our debates always ended with using Google Maps to settle the matter. Eventually, after taking a left turn, we came across an old wooden sign around midday. Its letters were faded and barely legible. Eric, of course, was thrilled. He thrived on these eerie, abandoned paths. Fear and Eric were sworn enemies. "This way," he declared, pointing toward a narrow, overgrown path that clearly hadn't seen much foot traffic in years. About an hour of hiking later, we stumbled upon a small, decrepit cabin sitting in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by towering trees. Its wooden exterior was warped and weathered, with patches of moss creeping up the walls. The windows were shattered, and the door hung slightly ajar. "Let's check it out," Eric said, already walking toward it. "Leave it. We're already too far from the camp," I muttered, feeling a pit in my stomach. "Come on, we're here. Think of the stories we can tell later," he said with excitement. Reluctantly, or maybe forcefully, I followed him. The air grew colder as Eric reached for the knob. The woods, which had been alive with sounds earlier, were now completely silent. No birds, no rustling leaves, nothing. My instincts screamed at me to turn back, but I couldn't leave Eric alone, nor did I want to go back alone myself. The door creaked loudly as Eric pushed it open. The inside was as abandoned as you'd expect. Broken furniture was scattered everywhere, chairs with missing legs, a table split down the middle. Graffiti covered the walls, most of it crude drawings or random words. "Looks like other hikers have been here before us," Eric said, brushing dust off a nearby shelf. I didn't reply, too busy scanning the room. Something about the place felt wrong, like we were intruding. Despite the unease, I followed Eric into what seemed to be the main room. That's when we smelled it, a putrid, sour stench wafting from a side room. "Ah, what is that?" Eric asked, covering his nose with his sleeve. "I don't know, but I think we should leave," I said, my voice shaking. "Just one quick look," he insisted. "We've come this far." Against my better judgment, we moved toward the smell. Eric pushed open the door, and I instantly regretted following him. The room was dark, with only a small sliver of light coming through a crack in the boarded-up window. On the floor were piles thousands of dead flies. Their tiny black bodies covered almost every inch of the wooden planks. Eric swore under his breath. This is messed up. I told you we shouldn't." Before I could finish my sentence, a shadow moved across the window just outside. It wasn't an animal. It was tall, human-like, but unnaturally quick. My heart stopped. "Did you see that?" I whispered. Eric turned to me, his face pale. "See what?" "The window," I said, pointing. Something just moved past it. We stood frozen, the hair on my neck rising as if someone was staring at us from the other side of the glass. Then, from somewhere outside, we heard a faint crunch of Leaves' footsteps. "Let's get out of here," Eric said, his voice trembling. We bolted out of the room and through the front door. As we stepped outside, I caught a flicker of movement in the woods, just a shadow, but I was certain it was staring at us. We didn't stop to think or talk. We just ran, like Usain Bolt on adrenaline. Branches whipped at our faces, and roots threatened to trip us, but we didn't dare slow down. My lungs burned, and my legs screamed for rest, but fear pushed me forward. "Keep going," Eric yelled, his voice full of panic. Finally, after what felt like hours, we reached the main trail. Ahead, we saw the outline of parked cars in the distance. Civilization. Safety. We didn't stop running until we reached Eric's car. Slamming the doors shut behind us, we sat there, gasping for air, drenched in sweat. What the hell was that?" Eric finally managed to say. I shook my head, unable to form words. My mind replayed the shadow, the flies, the oppressive silence of the cabin. We didn't call the authorities or tell anyone. Who would believe us? It would sound ridiculous. Now, 2 years later, we've graduated college, but the memory of that day still lingers. It's like a dark stain in the back of my mind, a chilling reminder that some places are better left unexplored. A few years ago, when I was 12 and my little brother Tommy was 10, our parents decided to go camping for the weekend. They loved finding secluded spots to immerse us in nature, and that year, they discovered Mount Rainier National Park. It was early fall, and the drive to the campsite was beautiful. The vibrant reds and oranges of the trees made everything look magical. Tommy and I were excited, as always, to explore the woods and make up stories about woodland creatures and imaginary forts. After arriving at the site, we spent most of the morning hiking while our parents set up camp. It wasn't unusual for us to wander off a bit. We'd always been careful not to stray too far. But this time, our curiosity got the better of us. We ended up walking miles into the deep forest without realizing it. Caught up in our chatter and laughter, we didn't notice how far we'd gone or how to find our way back. Even then, we weren't afraid. We sat beside a small stream, tossing stones and promising ourselves we'd head back to camp after a little while. That's when we noticed a young couple walking along a narrow path that crossed ours. At first glance, they looked like any other hikers dressed in outdoor gear, carrying backpacks. They smiled as they approached, and the man waved. "Hi," he said cheerfully. "What are you two doing here all alone?" Tommy and I exchanged a quick look. I decided to answer cautiously. "We're camping with our parents," I said, trying to keep my voice neutral. "Oh, nice," the woman chimed in, crouching slightly to get closer to Tommy. She smiled at him, but Tommy slid back a little, clearly uncomfortable. "What are your names?" she asked, her tone overly sweet. Tommy, blunt as ever, started to say, "Why do you?" but I nudged him and cut him off. "We should probably get back now," I said quickly. The man chuckled. "No need to rush. We're just exploring too. Maybe we can show you something really cool nearby." He gestured vaguely toward the trees behind him. Tommy, clearly annoyed, retorted, "No, we've seen everything cool here with our dad. He's the coolest person on earth." I pinched him, hoping he'd stop talking, but it backfired. He glared at me. "Why did you pinch me?" The woman knelt down again, smiling tightly. "You're safe with us, dear," she said, reaching out to touch Tommy's shoulder. Tommy, always bold, snapped, "Don't touch me." Embarrassed, the woman stood up and glanced at the man. Then, suddenly, she grabbed Tommy's hand firmly and tried to lead him down a side trail. That was when Tommy's quick thinking saved us. He bit her hand so hard she screamed, letting go in pain. Without hesitating, we ran as fast as we could back down the trail, shouting for Mom and Dad. We didn't stop running until we saw the familiar outline of our car in the distance. The sight gave us new energy, and we bolted straight for it, yelling the whole way. Our parents came running toward us, panic written all over their faces. As soon as they reached us, We collapsed into their arms, sobbing. "What happened?" Mom asked, holding us tightly. Tommy blurted out the entire story between gasps, and even though Dad laughed at some of Tommy's bold responses, I could see he was shaken. That night, our parents decided we couldn't stay at the campsite. They packed everything up quickly, and we drove to the nearest town to report the incident to the local authorities. At the police station, they took our story seriously and asked us to describe the couple in detail. I told them about the man's baseball cap, the woman's camera, and how she'd grabbed Tommy's hand. They listened intently, mentioning that similar cases had been reported recently. "This is the third case like this," the officer said. "We'll investigate immediately." A few days later, my dad got a call from the police. They informed him that the couple we'd encountered were suspects in a missing child case. Hearing that sent a chill through all of us. Mom was especially shaken. She grabbed Tommy and me, kissing us repeatedly as if she couldn't bear the thought of losing us. Years have passed since that day, but the memory is still vivid. It's a story Tommy and I share with people whenever they ask about our camping trips. While it's terrifying to recall, it also reminds us of how lucky we were. Today, Tommy and I still enjoy camping, but we're much more cautious. We stick to trails near others, and we never wander off without taking all the necessary precautions. That trip taught us an unforgettable lesson about trusting our instincts and staying vigilant. A long weekend at the Appalachian Trail is the dream of many campers in the U.S. The same goes for me and my two best friends, Emily and Nate. We fulfilled that dream a few years back in 2020. We were all experienced hikers, having explored many places together, but this trip felt like an adventure we'd been planning forever. We arrived on a Thursday morning, and both Thursday and Friday turned out to be everything we'd hoped for. We spent hours hiking through dense forests, climbing ridges, and laughing by the fire under a sky full of stars. Emily, the most organized person I've ever met, had mapped out every step of the journey. While standing near a peak, she suggested, "What if we camp near the stream?" We both loved her idea. She proposed it because we had been traveling miles to refill our water bottles, and the stream would save us the effort. Before sunset, we unpacked everything and pitched our tents at the new spot. We all sat near the stream, watching the sun dip below the horizon, a mutual love of ours. As the hues of pink and yellow turned to blue and stars began to decorate the sky, Emily grabbed her empty water bottles and flashlight. "I'll go fill these up before it gets too dark," she said, waving us off when we offered to join her. "It's not far. I'll be back in 10. "Don't get eaten by a bear," Nate teased, poking at the campfire. Emily rolled her eyes and disappeared down the trail. 10 minutes passed, then 20. Nate and I started to get restless, glancing at each other. "Where is she?" Nate asked, his tone shifting from playful to concern. I tried to shrug it off, telling him and myself that Emily was probably just taking her time. "She's fine," I said, more to reassure myself than Nate. Maybe she stopped to stargaze or something. But when 30 minutes passed, a buzzing sensation of dread settled in my stomach. Emily was always punctual, unlike me or Nate. Something wasn't right. "We should check on her," Nate said, already grabbing his flashlight. I followed him down the trail, calling Emily's name into the darkness. The stream wasn't far, just a 5-minute walk, but the air felt heavier with every step. When we reached the water, the faint glow of her flashlight lying near the bank caught my eye. Its beam pointed uselessly at the ground. Her water bottle was a few feet away, but there was no sign of Emily. "Emily?" I called, my voice cracking slightly. The forest swallowed the sound, offering no reply. Nate picked up the flashlight, his expression grim. "This isn't like her," he muttered. We searched the area together, going miles in every direction. Our voices echoed through the trees, but there was no sign of her. "We need to call the police," I gasped, realizing we couldn't find her on our own. Panic set in as we hurried back to camp and called for help. The search team arrived within 10 minutes, 15 people strong, their headlights slicing through the night as they fanned out into the woods. Nate and I stayed at the camp, answering questions and feeling increasingly helpless. Every minute felt like an hour, every sound like it might be Emily returning. We barely slept, sitting in silence with 2 officers by our side. Just after dawn, footsteps stirred us awake. It was Emily. Nate and I ran to her, relief washing over us like a wave. She looked dazed, walking slowly between 2 officers. Her clothes were torn, her face pale, and she cradled her arm as if it were injured. But she was alive. "Emily," I cried, pulling her into a hug. Her eyes darted nervously around the forest, as if she still expected something to jump out of the shadows. "He was following me," she whispered. My stomach sank. "Who? What happened?" The officers helped her to a nearby chair, and I handed her a water bottle. After a few sips, she took a shaky breath, her voice trembling as she spoke. "I was filling the bottles when I heard footsteps. At first, I thought it was one of you, but then I saw him, a man. He was standing just inside the trees, watching me. His face wasn't clear because of the shadows, but I could tell he wasn't anyone I'd ever seen before." "What did he do?" Nate asked, his voice tight. "He started walking toward me, not running, just following. I panicked. I ran as fast as I could, but I tripped and fell into the thicket. I stayed there all night, too scared to move." Her eyes welled with tears. "I thought he'd find me. I thought I was never getting out." The police patted her shoulder reassuringly. "We should take her to the hospital for a checkup." Nate and I nodded, packing up the campsite in silence as we followed their car to a nearby clinic. Emily was treated and then came back with us to my house, where we all stayed until Sunday. It took weeks for life to feel normal again. Every day, we called the police for updates, but after 3 weeks, the investigation hit a dead end. There was no trace of the man Emily described, no footprints, no campsite, nothing. It was as if he'd vanished into the woods. Emily recovered physically and returned to college, but the fear lingered. None of us could go back to the Appalachian Trail for 3 years. When we finally returned, it was with a larger group. Thankfully, that trip went without incident, helping us move past the nightmare. This happened to me in 2020, and I had just turned 28. I wanted to give myself a special gift, so I decided to go solo hiking in the Catskills. At midnight, I packed my stuff, and early the next morning, I set off for my dream camping trip. The first day was perfect. I reached the trailhead quite early, thanks to my Usain Bolt-like driving skills. The weather was absolutely lovely. Using maps, I found the coolest spot near a stream and pitched my tent there. The next day was dedicated to exploration. I chose a less traveled path leading toward a quiet clearing I'd heard about from other hikers and Facebook groups. The trail was narrow and winding, bordered by dense trees on both sides. Occasionally, the trees opened up to breathtaking views of the valley below. Around evening, I reached a quiet spot where the trail curved along a ridge. As I scanned the forest ahead, I noticed something unusual near the tree line. At first, I thought it was a large rock or fallen log, but as I got closer, I realized it was a man lying on the ground. He was sprawled on his side, partially hidden by the tall grass. He was heavy-set, dressed in a dark jacket and jeans, and utterly motionless. My first instinct was concern. Was he hurt? Unconscious? I slowed my steps, calling out, "Hey, are you okay?" There was no response. I hesitated, my backpack feeling heavier with each passing second. Something about the scene felt scary. His position seemed unnatural, almost staged. The forest, usually alive with birds chirping, was too quiet here. It felt as though the silence had engulfed the place. I took a cautious step forward but stopped a few feet away. My gut screamed at me to turn around, but my rational mind argued otherwise. What if he needs help? What if he's in danger? I called out again, louder this time. Sir, can you hear me? Still nothing. I debated waking him up, even stepping closer, but something held me back. Maybe it was the stillness in the air or the way his body seemed too perfectly placed. The situation didn't feel right. My heart raced as I backed away, trying to steady myself, keeping my eyes on him. Once I felt I was at a safe distance, I turned and walked briskly down the trail, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. 2 hours later, I reached a ranger station, breathless and uneasy. Yes, ma'am, a ranger asked from behind the front desk. He listened attentively as I described what I'd seen. A man lying near the tree line. Unconscious? He repeated, scribbling notes. Yes, I said, my voice trembling slightly. He didn't move or respond when I called out. I didn't get too close, but something felt wrong. The ranger nodded, reassuring me they'd investigate immediately. He called for a team to check the area while I waited at the station, sipping lukewarm coffee and trying to calm my nerves. When the team returned hours later, their faces bore no answers. We didn't find anyone, the lead ranger said, shaking his head. What do you mean? I stammered. He was right there, near the tree line. He couldn't have just disappeared. We searched thoroughly, he assured me. There were no signs of a person, no disturbed ground, nothing to indicate someone had been there recently. I felt a chill creep up my spine. I knew what I'd seen. It wasn't my imagination. The rangers tried to reassure me, suggesting I might have stumbled upon a shadow or a trick of the light. Sometimes the forest plays tricks on your eyes, one of them said kindly. But I wasn't convinced. I knew what I saw, a man lying on the ground, unmoving. I spent that night at a small motel near the ranger station, unable to face the thought of camping alone again, at least for a while. I tossed and turned, my mind replaying the image of the man over and over. His stillness, the unnatural quiet of the woods, the way everything felt wrong. The next morning, I went back to my campsite, packed my things, and headed home. 2 days later, I was back at work and living my normal life, yet the event lingered in the back of my mind. Whenever I think about it, I'm left with no answers, only questions. Months passed, and though I continued hiking, I couldn't bring myself to venture out alone in the woods again. The Catskills are still my favorite place, and I do visit them sometimes, but I avoid the woods when I'm by myself. Now, 4 years later, my work has brought me to live in a hill station. It's a great place to be, surrounded by nature. The forest is nearby, and I visit it often, but always with a counselor. I share my experience with others and work as a guide in my free time, helping people explore the woods safely. The forest remains a place of awe for me, a canopy of mystery and beauty. It taught me how to face dangers and embrace solitude. Yet, it also taught me to listen to my instincts because sometimes they're all that stand between you and the unknown.